When the chandeliers blaze and the silver gleams, a single whisper shatters the script. Shut up, don't say a word. On a gilded Thanksgiving night in Newport, a widowed magnate lifts his glass, unaware he's stepping into a snare. A missing ledger, a torn steamer ticket, and a maid who refuses to be silent collide beneath the glitter, summoning a storm of class, conscience, and a past that refuses to stay buried. Duty stands at the head of the table. Desire takes a breath at the door. One choice will decide everything. Tell us where you're listening from, what city, what cozy corner, and share this. In period romances, what captivates you most? Honor or the heart's rebellion? Newport, Rhode Island, November of 1895. A silver fog clung to the shore as the sea sighed beyond the marble walls of the Channing estate. The day was brisk, perfumed with salt and chimney smoke, and within the grand house on Bellevue Avenue, the final Thursday of November unfurled like a performance. Everything glittered, but nothing felt still. Below stairs, in the narrow warmth of the servants' corridor, Haley Byrne moved with quiet precision. Her dark grey cotton dress, fastened with polished mother-of-pearl buttons, brushed against her ankles as she stepped between the pantry and the silver room. A starched white apron cinched her slender waist, and her auburn hair, pinned tightly beneath a modest cap, caught golden flecks of morning light each time she turned her head. She was 27 years old and had long ago trained her breath to match the rhythm of duty. And yet on this day, her pulse betrayed her calm. The table upstairs had been set to impress. 12 places for the elite, flanked by 12 more for those who thought themselves nearly as important. At its center gleamed a garland of fresh roses imported from Charleston, resting upon Belgian lace that cost more than the annual wages of 3 housemaids combined. Silver candelabras stretched toward the ceiling like chalices raised to power. It was an altar, Haley thought, not to gratitude, but to illusion. She carried a decanter of cranberry cordial into the drawing room and paused briefly behind the velvet curtains, her eyes landing on the seating chart discreetly affixed to a gilded easel. Her hands, usually steady, hesitated. A name had been added, one that had not appeared on the butler's final copy the night before. Mr. Elias Whitlock. It was a bold addition, and a dangerous one. Haley's brow furrowed. She glanced around the parlor. No one saw her slip closer. The ink on the name was still slightly damp. Someone wanted this to feel last minute. Someone wanted surprise. That alone would have meant little if not for what was missing. The butler's ledger. It had lived always, locked inside the second drawer of the walnut console beside the cellar stairs. It held everything: guest arrivals, wine allocations, servant notes, discreet expenses. And that morning, when Haley had gone to fetch it for the cook, the drawer had been empty. She had not spoken of it, not yet, but the hollow space in that drawer whispered louder than any warning. Upstairs, in the gold and cream foyer, the orchestra struck its first notes. Polished shoes stepped onto imported rugs. Beatrix Channing, in a silk gown the color of champagne, descended like a portrait come to life, her chin high and her expression composed with the cruel elegance of a girl who had never been told no. She was 24, beautiful in the way of glass, clear, flawless and sharp-edged. Her diamond choker sparkled with each movement. The room adored her, and she absorbed it like breath. Haley, watching from a discreet corner behind the floral screens, could not take her eyes off the woman's smile. It was as practiced as a blade. Then the door opened. The room stilled. Elias Whitlock entered with the grace of a man who no longer needed to announce himself. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a dark navy wool coat that hung like authority on his frame. A mourning pin in onyx and silver glinted from his lapel. His dark brown hair, threaded with grey at the temples, was brushed back with meticulous care. He removed his gloves slowly, deliberately, and the silence that welcomed him was the kind reserved for men who owned ships and secrets. Haley had never seen him in person. only heard of him spoken of in hushes, the widower, the magnate, the man whose brother had drowned in a storm that some said hadn't been an accident. As he crossed the room, his eyes swept the table, the chandelier, the place cards. When they met hers, only for a moment, Haley felt something inside her still. Not fear, not admiration, something quieter, recognition. Beatrix approached him, a smile unfurling like lace. "Mr. Whitlock," she purred, extending her hand. "We are so honored." Her voice had the softness of snow before it hardens. He bowed, but did not kiss her hand. The guests settled. The air thickened with anticipation. From the corner of the room, the journalist, Mr. Livingston, adjusted his pocket watch, too eagerly. The family solicitor cleared his throat 3 times in quick succession. Every motion told a story if one knew how to read it, and Haley did. She lingered near the entry to the dining room, pretending to adjust a tray of porcelain soup bowls. She was close enough to hear Beatrix whisper, "Elias will speak after the first course. Let the toast be clear." A toast, not discussed in the staff briefings, not noted on the service flow, and in this house, nothing unscripted was allowed, unless it was meant to appear unscripted. Haley's chest tightened. Her fingers curled tightly around the linen napkin she carried. She didn't know the details, but the shape of the trap was clear. A man brought in at the last moment asked to speak, surrounded by those with ears to weaponize a single word. The dinner bell rang. Chairs scraped against the floor. The staff began their quiet ballet. Dishes in, dishes out, no eye contact, no mistakes. Haley circled to the sideboard, standing within earshot of Elias as he rose to his feet. A crystal glass in his hand caught the light. Guests turned toward him. All eyes waited. She moved swiftly. Her heart thundered. She stepped behind him, close enough that her breath stirred the fabric of his sleeve. And softly, so softly, she whispered, "Shut up. Don't say a word." He froze. His fingers tensed around the glass. Slowly, he lowered it. A ripple moved through the room, as if a breeze had passed through velvet. Beatrix's eyes narrowed. Mr. Livingston frowned and reached again for his pen. Elias did not speak. Instead, he offered a cool, unreadable smile and returned to his seat. He glanced once over his shoulder, not directly at Haley, but toward the space where he now knew someone had intervened. Haley stepped back into the shadows, her breath trembling. The trap had been interrupted, but not dismantled. Not yet. The first course was served under the flicker of gaslight and polite confusion. Outside, the sea continued its quiet vigil, indifferent to secrets or spectacles. Inside, the night held its breath. The clink of silver against porcelain rang like a distant bell tower, too delicate to interrupt the tension that had settled over the Channing dining room. Above, the chandelier burned with the golden light of over 100 candles, refracted by the crystal drops that trembled slightly with each vibration of the floor. Beneath it, 24 guests sat in postures of perfection, faces arranged in practiced expressions of curiosity, amusement, or studied indifference. Yet behind each smile, each fluttering fan or lifted glass, there was watchfulness. Haley Byrne moved along the wall in near silence, her shoes gliding over the imported Turkish rug. The air was heavy with scents. Spiced pumpkin soup laced with cream and nutmeg, warm rolls with glistening crusts, roasted chestnuts steeped in Madeira. But beneath it all, Haley smelled something else. Intent. She passed behind a servant boy refilling wine glasses and caught the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere when Julian Channing leaned toward the man beside him. The guest, Mr. Livingston, the columnist from the New York Sentinel, wore a carnation that had begun to wilt against his lapel, yet his eyes were sharp and alive, narrowed slightly as Julian murmured into his ear. Julian's voice was too low to be heard clearly, but Haley noticed the way his fingers tapped his wineglass twice before he spoke. A nervous tick she had seen before, usually just before he lied. Mr. Livingston nodded once, and a slight smile crossed his lips. The type of smile that comes not from amusement, but satisfaction. She moved on, carrying a fresh linen napkin to the lady of the house. But her mind lingered on the exchange. Julian had arrived earlier than expected that evening, and with him had come a cloud of unseen preparation, small changes in seating, a locked cellar, and a sudden tension among the household staff. These were not the normal rhythms of grand dinners. These were the silent movements of manipulation. As she neared the dining room door, Haley caught a glimpse of the butler, Mr. Quinn, standing near the wine cart. His white gloves trembled as he reached for a decanter. The man, known for his stoic silence and precision, was visibly uneasy. When his eyes met hers, he looked away too quickly. Haley hesitated. That same morning, she had searched for the service ledger in its usual place, the drawer beneath the staircase where Mr. Quinn kept all the records. It had been gone. No explanation, no word. Now the man could barely pour a glass of Burgundy without his fingers twitching. Something had rattled him. She returned to the passage behind the dining room, where the murmurs of the guests carried like fog through the corridor. There, she pressed her back lightly to the wall and listened, not with the hunger of gossip, but with the urgency of someone piecing together a fragile puzzle before it shattered. Voices wove together like threads. I hear Mr. Whitlock may invest in the South Carolina line. Poor Elias. Such tragedy seems to cling to him, doesn't it? Surely you don't believe that business about the steamer. The last voice came from a woman with lilac gloves and an English accent sharpened by wealth. The reply was muffled, but Haley caught the name Ambrose Whitlock, Elias's brother, and the words unseasonable storm and sealed will. She closed her eyes just for a breath and was pulled back to another time, a memory sharp as the scent of oil and soot. She was 16 again, standing in the rain outside the iron gates of Blackthorn Textile Mill. Her brother Aidan had not come out with the others. Hours passed. When the news came, machine failure, no witnesses, no compensation, Haley had swallowed her scream and gone back the next morning to clean the floor where his blood had dried into the wood grain. That was the day she learned silence was as deadly as the machines. From that moment on, she listened, she watched, she remembered. Now nearly a decade later, the rhythm was familiar, a powerful family spinning a tale, a dead man whose truth had no voice, and a room of polished faces hiding knowledge behind politeness. Returning to the kitchen to retrieve the next course, she passed the steward's office and noticed the door slightly ajar. Something on the floor caught her eye, a corner of stiff, aged paper, torn and stained. She crouched, and as she slid it free, her heart skipped. It was a piece of a steamer ticket, dated 4 months prior. The name was mostly smudged, but the last name, Whitlock, remained legible. Her breath caught. Ambrose Whitlock had died in July aboard a private steamer bound for Charleston. The incident had been deemed an accident, a tragic loss during foul weather. But this ticket, this forgotten corner hidden beneath the steward's cabinet, suggested something else. Perhaps he hadn't been meant to travel that day. Perhaps someone had arranged it, or altered it. She tucked the fragment into the cuff of her sleeve and rose quickly, just as a scullery maid burst into the hall, breathless. "They're asking for the second course, Miss Byrne," she whispered. "You're to present the duck." Haley nodded and returned to the front. As she emerged into the dining room once more, the conversation had shifted. Lighter now, as if a communal agreement had been reached to avoid shadows. Elias Whitlock sat between Augustus Channing and a rail baron from Connecticut. His posture was calm, but Haley saw the flicker of discomfort behind his eyes. His plate remained untouched. His gaze drifted, often and almost unconsciously, to the far end of the table, to where Beatrix laughed too sweetly with the senator's daughter. As Haley approached with the silver tray of roasted duck, her eyes met his briefly. In that moment, something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but a shared understanding. This room, for all its refinement, was a battlefield. She moved on, silent and swift. When the last plate had been served, Haley took her place behind the carved sideboard, eyes lowered, hands folded. The page fragment pressed against her wrist, a quiet burn. She did not yet know who had hidden the ticket, or who had altered the guest list, or why Mr. Quinn trembled when Elias entered the room. But she knew what danger looked like, and it had seated itself at this table with all the ease of an invited guest. As the guests sipped from their goblets and the orchestra resumed a light waltz in the adjoining salon, Haley watched Julian Channing rise from his seat. He adjusted his cravat and strolled toward the hall. Mr. Livingston followed a moment later, nodding to no one. She slipped after them. Just past the staircase, concealed by a tapestry, Haley leaned in. Julian's voice was velvet, wrapped in poison. "You'll get your story, Livingston, but let it fall next week when the contracts are signed." "And Whitlock?" the journalist asked, amused. Julian's answer chilled her. "He won't see it coming." Haley stepped back, her hands clammy despite the cool stone underfoot. The chandeliers still glowed, the duck was still warm, the music still played. But beneath it all, the truth simmered, fragrant and dangerous. And Haley Byrne, once an invisible maid in a house of power, now held the first thread that might unravel it all. The night had shed its finery. The candelabras had been extinguished, the silver polished and put away. The laughter that once spilled through the halls of the Channing estate, now silenced by sleep or weariness, or, in some, by fear. Midnight had passed, and with it the illusion of perfection that blanketed the house like the snowless frost gathering on the glass. In the conservatory, far from the creaking floorboards and murmuring firelight of the main house, Elias Whitlock stood alone. The room stretched out like a crystal chapel. Its arched windows soared overhead, framed by wrought-iron tracery now cloaked in a sheen of condensation. A small oil lamp flickered near the center table, casting long, golden shadows that danced against the stone floor. The scent of night-blooming jasmine drifted faintly in from the garden beyond, ghostly and fragile. He removed his gloves slowly, setting them atop the table beside his overcoat. His posture was impeccable, yet the lines of his shoulders betrayed a heaviness, one not caused by business or loss alone, but by the peculiar stillness that follows a betrayal not yet proven, but deeply suspected. Footsteps approached. They were soft but certain, measured, like someone who knew how to be both silent and seen. When Haley Byrne entered the conservatory, her presence was not announced by sound, but by a shift in the air itself. She closed the door gently behind her, then stood for a moment just within the threshold, her figure silhouetted against the soft amber light. Her dress, still the plain grey of service, bore faint creases from hours of movement. A strand of auburn hair had escaped her tightly pinned bun and curved against her cheek like a whisper. Elias turned slowly. His hazel eyes, thoughtful and unreadable, settled on her. "You came," he said softly. Haley nodded once. "Because it cannot wait." She crossed the room without hesitation, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze lifted, not in challenge, but in quiet resolve. "I won't waste your time," she said, standing across from him near the table. "I have something to show you, and something to ask." He gestured to the chair, but she shook her head. "No, I'll stand." Elias tilted his head slightly but said nothing more. He retrieved a small key from his pocket, opened the drawer of the table, and took out a folded square of cloth. Gently, he placed it between them. "For your hands," he said. "They're trembling." Haley glanced down, surprised to find that he was right. She accepted the cloth with a small nod of gratitude. Then, with deliberate care, she reached into her sleeve and withdrew a folded piece of aged paper, a torn steamer ticket. She laid it on the table between them. "It was buried beneath the steward's cabinet," she said. "Dropped maybe, forgotten, but it shouldn't exist." Elias leaned closer, inspecting the fragment with narrowed eyes. His breath caught when he read the name. "Whitlock." "It's dated the day before your brother's death," she said, "but the name was crossed off, then rewritten. Someone meant to erase it, then change their mind." He straightened slowly, as though the weight of the implication had just settled fully onto his shoulders. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence was not awkward, but dense, alive with unspoken recognition. "I feared something like this," he said at last. "But suspicion without proof is noise." Haley's voice was low, steady. "There's more than that." She unfolded a second slip of paper, smudged, creased, but legible. A list of names and payments. One of them was circled. "Julian Channing," she said, "was seen paying off a footman the day after the death. That footman was dismissed 2 days later, sent to Charleston with a letter of reference, but his route took him through the same port your brother's ship departed from." Elias's jaw tensed. His hands, resting on the back of the chair, curled into fists, then slowly relaxed. "And you're certain?" "I don't speak on what I don't know. I listen. I observe." Her voice softened, but there was steel beneath it. "And I don't keep secrets that protect men like him." He looked at her then, not as a maid, not as a servant who had overstepped, but as a woman who had risked everything to tell the truth. There was no arrogance in her, no ambition, only the quiet conviction of someone who had lost too much to silence. "You said you had something to ask," he said gently. Haley inhaled slowly. "I want you to hear me, Mr. Whitlock. Not just what I'm saying, but what it means." He said nothing, but he stepped away from the table and stood before her, closer now. "I am not offering this because I seek favor," she continued, "or safety, or position. I am offering it because I've seen what silence buys in a house like this, what it buries. I've buried it myself before." Her voice faltered slightly. The memory of her brother passed through her eyes like a shadow across glass. "I need to know," she said more quietly now, "that if I step further into this, I do not become another tool in someone else's hand. I am not a pawn, not yours, not theirs." Elias's expression did not soften, but it deepened. He saw her now, fully, not just for what she revealed, but for what she withheld. Pride, grief, dignity, and a quiet loneliness she did not name. "You have my word," he said, "that you will never be used, not by me." She met his eyes. And something settled between them then. Not alliance yet, but the beginning of one, a recognition, a weight shared. "Thank you," she said. He reached into his coat and drew out a folded handkerchief, not for formality, but to wrap the torn ticket, protecting it. "May I keep this?" he asked. Haley hesitated, then nodded. He paused. "May I also ask something of you?" Her breath caught. "Yes." He stepped to the sideboard, where a decanter of port waited untouched, and poured a small measure into a glass. He offered it to her, not as a servant, but as an equal, a bearer of truth. "To the ones who told the truth when it cost them," he said. Haley accepted the glass with a trembling hand, but did not drink. Outside, the wind brushed against the panes, soft as breath. The night folded in around the conservatory, wrapping them in a kind of stillness that existed only in moments like this. Between danger and decision, they stood together, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the weight of what was beginning. Across the house, in the darkness of the study, a shadow passed through the corridor. The butler, Mr. Quinn, stopped before the heavy oak door, glanced once over his shoulder, and slid a sealed envelope beneath it. Inside the envelope, the missing ledger page waited, its ink faded, but the truth still clear. And in the conservatory, beneath a ceiling of glass and stars, a man who had once believed silence was survival began to listen, and a woman who had once buried her grief in silence began, at last, to speak. Morning came slowly to the Channing estate. Pale light seeped through lace curtains, brushing against marquetry floors and silk damask walls with a timidity that suited the mood inside. The echo of the previous evening still lingered like perfume, beautiful at first, then cloying, bitter, impossible to ignore. In the east wing, behind doors carved with gold leaf scrolls and lacquered crests, Beatrix Channing sat at her vanity, unmoving. The pearls at her throat had not been removed. Her gown from the night before, champagne silk, delicate French lace at the collar and cuffs, hung like armor. Her golden hair was still arranged in the fashionable Gibson pompadour, but a loose strand curled along her temple as if wilting under the weight of her own perfection. She stared into the mirror, not to admire her reflection, but to study the woman she had become, one who could not read the heart of a man despite knowing the cost of every ruby in the room, one whose future had been promised and yet felt less secure with each passing glance from her intended. Her hands, white and slender, folded tightly in her lap. A knock came at the door. She did not turn. "Enter!" The butler stepped in, his face weary, his eyes cast downward. He held a single card on a silver tray. "Mr. Whitlock requests a word," he said. Beatrix took the card without touching it. "He may come." A few moments later, Elias Whitlock crossed the threshold of her room. He wore a charcoal morning coat, a dove-grey waistcoat, and a black cravat tied with impeccable precision. Yet there was something less rigid in his expression than usual. His gaze, always serious, now carried a quiet weight, one not of business, but of something unspoken and perhaps unkind. "Beatrix," he said with a nod. She stood slowly. Her voice was calm but clipped. "You're early." "It couldn't wait. I gathered as much." They stood with a few feet between them, the way two strangers might, forced to converse by duty rather than desire. She gestured to the upholstered settee near the window. Please." He remained standing. "I came to speak plainly," he said. Beatrix's chin lifted slightly. "That would be a first in this house." Elias did not smile. "What are we doing, Beatrix?" She blinked. "We are preparing for the future. A future that aligns your influence with my name, our family's fortunes." "No," he interrupted, his tone not cruel but firm. "Not the family's, not the fortunes. Us." Beatrix inhaled sharply, as though the word itself had offended her. "You knew what this was," she said. "From the beginning, you came into our drawing room with your manners, your mourning pin, and your silence. You never claimed love. You claimed strategy." "I did," Elias admitted, "and I believed it would be enough. But now," her voice cracked like porcelain, "now that a maid has your attention, you find strategy inadequate." He stiffened. "She risked something last night," he said carefully. "Something I respect." Beatrix turned away, her shoulders trembling. "Do not humiliate me with the word respect. I've seen how men hide behind it when they wish to protect a woman, just not the one they promised." "She's not the reason I hesitated," Elias replied quietly. "You are." Beatrix spun back toward him. "I gave you everything they taught me to give," she whispered, her voice trembling beneath its polish. "Charm, obedience, discretion, and you looked at me like I was a ledger entry." Elias's expression faltered. "And perhaps I was," she said, her voice rising, "but I was raised to believe that was enough." He stepped toward her. Not in anger, but in sorrow. "Beatrix, I'm sorry, not for the truth, but for how little truth was ever offered to you." She met his gaze. For one suspended moment, she looked like the girl she might have been, if taught that love was more than strategy. But then she blinked, and the woman of society returned. "You should go," she said. Elias inclined his head. "You deserve honesty, even if it's late." As he left the room, she turned back to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, flawless, still, but a single tear slipped down her cheek, unnoticed even by herself. That afternoon, the lower floors of the house swelled with quiet activity. Servants moved like currents in a tide, subtle, constant, watchful. In the servants' hall, Haley Byrne leaned over a copper sink, scrubbing a silver ladle until it gleamed. She did not look up when Martha, one of the younger maids, entered with trembling hands and wide eyes. "Miss Byrne," the girl whispered, "I need to tell you something." Haley wiped her hands on her apron and motioned for the girl to sit. "It's about Mr. Julian," Martha said, "and what he said to Lottie the day before she was sent away." Haley's heart tightened. "Go on." Martha glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. He cornered her in the wine cellar. Said if she spoke to anyone about the package that never arrived, he'd ruin her. Said no one would believe a maid over a gentleman. Then the next day, she was gone. Haley swallowed. Did you tell anyone? No, but I can't sleep. I see Lottie's face every time I close my eyes. She was scared. Haley reached across the table and took the girl's hand. You did the right thing. After Martha left, Haley returned to the kitchen, where the cook, Mrs. Alden, stirred a pot of oyster stew. Did you ever hear Mr. Quinn say something about a debt? Haley asked quietly. The cook paused, then nodded. Once, years ago, after Ambrose Whitlock's funeral, he was drunk on brandy, muttering to himself in the scullery. Said he owed a dead man more than a signature. I thought he was just mourning. But he's never spoken of it since? No, and he's not the type to let loose twice. Haley stared at the steam rising from the pot. The scent of salt and cream curled into her lungs, warm but unwelcome. Too many people knew too much, and yet no one would speak unless cornered. She stepped out into the servants' passageway, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, her thoughts heavy with connections. Lottie, Julian, the butler, a debt, a name scratched and rewritten on a steamer ticket, a story stitched not with ink, but with silence. That evening, as twilight turned the sky to smoke, Mr. Livingston, the columnist, was seen near the docks. He spoke with 2 porters, then visited the telegraph office. A wire was sent to New York. Haley learned this from the postboy, who passed it along with the same tone one might use to deliver gossip, thrilled and half afraid. The next morning the air would carry the scent of ink and ink alone. But for now the storm had not yet arrived. And in a house where every surface gleamed and every truth was buried beneath layers of civility, the first cracks were beginning to show. Porcelain, no matter how fine, always breaks along its weakest seam. The morning broke grey and tight, as though the sky itself had been laced shut with threadbare patience. A light drizzle kissed the windows of the Channing estate, veiling the landscape in pale mist, blurring the manicured hedges and marble statues that lined the gravel path. But inside, the walls whispered more loudly than the rain. In the scullery, behind a heavy oak door, now bolted from the outside, Haley Byrne sat on a low wooden stool. Her apron was crumpled in her lap, her cap askew. The air was damp with the scent of stone and root vegetables, and faintly metallic, like the hush that comes before thunder. She had been there for nearly 2 hours, alone, unaddressed, and accused. The housekeeper, rigid and too swift to judgment, had presented the claim without hesitation. Silver cutlery gone missing from the sideboard drawer after last night's supper. Suspicion had fallen, as it always did, not on the incompetent, but on the discreet, on the girl who moved silently, who listened too closely, who knew too much. There had been no shouting, no confrontation. Only the cold voice of authority and the firm hand of a footman who guided Haley by the elbow, as though she were already guilty. No one had dared meet her eyes. But Haley had not begged. She had not defended herself. She had walked in silence down the stairs, past the flickering wall sconces and through the narrow corridor of stone and shadows, knowing better than anyone that truth was often less powerful than perception. Her palms rested on her knees. Calm, despite the storm forming inside her. Outside the scullery door, whispers threaded the passageways. The staff was rattled, some in quiet sympathy, others in cautious detachment. Only the cook had looked uncertain, but uncertainty never outranked fear in a house like this. Upstairs, the drawing-room filled with the subdued rustle of morning callers and the hushed exchange of family conversations, too refined to mention scandal and too calculating to ignore it. In the west corridor, Elias Whitlock stood near the carved balustrade, speaking with Augustus Channing, whose brows had collapsed into a permanent furrow. Protocol must be followed, Augustus insisted. The girl's guilt is not the issue. It's the appearance of disorder. This is my household, my legacy. I will not allow doubt to ferment under my roof. Elias's gaze, steady and unflinching, did not waver. And what if the doubt is warranted? What if the charge itself is the disorder? Augustus stepped closer. Your sentiment is admirable, Elias. But sentiment is a poor substitute for control. The girl will be dismissed quietly. It's already handled. No, Elias said, the word quiet but absolute. Augustus blinked. Excuse me? I said no. A maid passing through with linens froze in place, wide-eyed. Elias took a step back from the railing. Where is she? A pause followed. Too long. She's been locked below stairs, Augustus replied coolly, until the matter can be resolved discreetly. Disgust flickered in Elias's eyes. This isn't a matter. It's a human being. And with that, he turned on his heel. Down 2 flights of stairs he went, the weight of his boots echoing against polished wood and then stone. When he reached the scullery, he did not knock. He pounded. Open this door. The footman on duty, a young man with more muscle than sense, appeared uncertain. Sir, I was instructed. I said open it. The door creaked, and Haley stood slowly as the light spilled in. Her eyes met Elias's, and for a long breath, neither of them spoke. She did not rush forward. He did not reach for her, but something in the space between them shifted, tension not born of scandal or fear, but of recognition. He stepped into the room. The air was cool and tight around them. The drizzle outside had deepened into a soft patter on the windows. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly. I should be the first one here, he replied. Her mouth trembled, but she did not look away. Do you believe them? No. His voice was low, certain. She swallowed. Her fingers twisted the hem of her apron, slowly, like unwinding thread. Why do you care? The question was not asked with bitterness, but with the nakedness of someone who had learned not to expect rescue. Elias's voice softened. Because truth doesn't matter if it's only reserved for those with titles. She held his gaze. The air thickened. You should go, she whispered. He didn't move. And leave you here, locked beneath their perfection? I've lived beneath it all my life, she said, more bitter than she meant to be. Elias stepped closer. Still no touch, just nearness. I've spent years pretending that duty was purpose, he said. That control could protect me from loss. That silence was a shield. Her breath hitched. And was it? No. It was a prison. She turned away, blinking back the sharp sting of emotion. Her voice dropped. I know something about prisons. Behind them, a footman appeared in the hallway, but Elias raised a hand without looking, and the man vanished again. You will not be dismissed, he said. Not now, not ever by my hand. Haley nodded once, tightly, but her body remained rigid, unwilling to fully believe it. You may not be dismissed, she said, but I can be discarded. Elias reached toward her, then stopped, his hand suspended in air just inches from her sleeve. The space between his fingers and her wrist pulsed with something unspeakable. Not lust, not longing. Something purer, something braver. He did not touch her, but she felt it. The truth of it. That afternoon, the butler, Mr. Quinn, removed his gloves for the last time. He stood in the anteroom with a satchel in hand and a resignation letter folded neatly in his pocket. He did not look at the other servants. He did not offer explanation. But when he passed through the front door into the foggy streets of Newport, he left behind a sealed envelope. It did not go to the housekeeper nor to Augustus. It went directly to Elias Whitlock's solicitor, delivered by a discreet boy instructed never to reveal who paid him. Inside the envelope were pages, inked in fine script, signed and notarized, detailing everything. The missing ledger page, the falsified wine order, the altered guest list, and a line that read, I owe the dead more than silence. This is what I should have done the night Ambrose Whitlock died. By evening, the scullery door had been left open. The house was quiet again, but beneath the silence, beneath the stairs, above the rail, a reckoning had begun. And in the absence of touch, 2 hands, nearly joined, had altered the course of everything. The first snow of December arrived not with softness, but with purpose. It came driven by a sharp Atlantic wind that rattled the window panes of the Channing estate, drawing sighs from the chimneys and leaving pale streaks upon the marble steps. Inside, the house glowed with firelight and ceremony. Every corridor flickered with the illusion of comfort, as if warmth could disguise the coldness that reigned behind every closed door. Down below, in the depths where cellars and storage rooms intertwined like veins beneath the house, Haley Byrne walked carefully with a lantern in hand. The faint scent of dust and cork filled the narrow passage, mixed with the heavy aroma of oak barrels. She had come only to inventory the wines for the next dinner, a routine task, one that ought to have felt safe. Yet even before she reached the far alcove, she sensed she was not alone. "Miss Byrne," came a voice from the shadows. The syllables stretched slowly, with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted her to feel trapped. "You seem to have a fondness for basements." Julian Channing stepped into the light, the gleam of the lantern catching the pearl pin at his cravat. His face, handsome in its symmetry, was made cruel by drink. He leaned one shoulder against the brick wall, his smile practiced and venomous. Haley's pulse quickened, but she did not step back. "You shouldn't be here, Mr. Channing. This part of the house is for the staff." "Ah," he said, pretending to consider it, "and yet you seem to forget your place quite often, Miss Byrne, whispering in corners with my cousin's guests, meddling in affairs far above your understanding." His gaze dropped to her hands. "What is it you think you're doing, collecting scraps of gossip and bits of paper? Do you imagine anyone will listen to you when the time comes?" Haley drew in a steady breath, keeping her voice calm. "Truth doesn't need permission to be heard, it only needs courage." Julian's laugh echoed off the stone walls, low and bitter. "Courage," he repeated, as though tasting the word and finding it amusing. "How poetic. Tell me, does courage keep you warm when you're cast out without a reference, when no house in Newport or Providence will hire you?" He stepped closer. She could smell the brandy on his breath, thick and sour. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the lantern. "I've heard," he continued, "that you and Mr. Whitlock share an understanding. I wonder what kind of understanding that might be." The implication was filthier than his words. Haley's cheeks burned, but she refused to let him see the humiliation. "Whatever you think you know," she said quietly, "says more about you than it ever could about him." Julian's smile hardened. He reached for her wrist with a sudden movement, gripping it tightly enough to draw a gasp from her lips. The lantern swayed, casting wild shadows across the barrels. His voice dropped to a hiss. "Listen to me carefully. You will stop asking questions. You will stop prying into business that has nothing to do with you. If you don't, I'll make sure you disappear as neatly as your little friend Lottie did." For a heartbeat, fear threatened to hollow her out. But then something older than fear stirred in her chest, the same fire that had carried her through loss and injustice. She wrenched her arm free with a sharp twist, the metal of the lantern scraping his sleeve. His surprise gave her a single instant, and she took it, stepping back, lifting the lantern high like a shield of flame. "I will not be silent," she said, her voice trembling but fierce. "Not again." She turned and ran before he could stop her, the sound of her steps echoing up the stairs, her heart drumming in her ears. When she reached the corridor above, she leaned against the wall, clutching her bruised arm. The skin already ached beneath her sleeve, but the pain only sharpened her clarity. She knew now. There would be no peace, no safety, until the truth came to light. Elias Whitlock found Beatrix that evening in the music room. The fire burned low, leaving the space wrapped in shadows that shimmered faintly against her pale silk gown. She sat at the piano, her hands resting on the keys but not pressing them, her reflection wavering in the polished wood like a ghost of herself. "Beatrix," he said, stepping inside. She did not look up. "I was told you'd gone to town." "I did," he replied, "to speak with my solicitor." At that her fingers tensed on the ivory keys. "About what?" Elias laid a folded document on the small table beside the settee. The ledger page your butler left behind, and his statement. Beatrix's head turned sharply. His statement? Elias's tone remained controlled, but beneath it pulsed quiet anger. He confessed that payments were made to servants to ensure silence, that records were altered to disguise inconsistencies in shipping manifests, and that those orders came from someone in this house. Her face drained of color. For a moment, she said nothing. Then her chin lifted with fragile defiance. I had to protect my family's name, she said. You don't understand what that means in Newport, in this world. A single rumor can destroy everything. Your protection, Elias replied, cost my brother his life. Beatrix flinched as though struck. I didn't know, she whispered. Not all of it. Father told me it was an accident, that Julian had made a mistake, but it could be corrected quietly. He said your family would be spared disgrace that way. Disgrace, Elias said softly, is not the same as justice. Beatrix turned her face away. Her eyes glistened in the half-light. What will you do? What I should have done months ago, he said. Find the truth, no matter whom it exposes. You'll ruin us. Then perhaps ruin is what's needed. She rose to her feet, trembling but proud. Do you think you're better than us, Elias? Because you wear your guilt with dignity? You play at being righteous, but righteousness is a luxury of the powerful. The rest of us survive by compromise. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression not cruel, but profoundly sad. If survival means silence, then perhaps I no longer wish to survive as you do. He left her standing there among the dying notes of an unsounded melody. The silence that followed was heavier than any music could have been. Later that night, in his study, Elias drafted a letter to his private investigators in Boston. The lamplight glowed over the parchment as he wrote, each word deliberate, his pen steady. Verify every name listed in the ledger. Question the dismissed servants. Find the footman sent to Charleston and the maid who fled to Philadelphia. Spare no expense. Discretion is secondary to truth. When the letter was sealed, he rang for a messenger and sat back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The fire in the grate popped softly, casting his face in amber light. On the corner of his desk lay the torn steamer ticket and a folded handkerchief, Haley's. He had found it days ago in the conservatory, left behind without intention. The fabric was plain, mended twice at the corner. He had kept it not for sentiment, but as a reminder of something he could not yet name. The next morning, Haley rose before dawn. Her arm throbbed faintly from the bruise Julian's grip had left, but her resolve was unbroken. She dressed quickly, her uniform crisp, her hair pinned with precision. The servants' hall was still dark, save for the dim glow of embers in the hearth. A knock came at the back door. 3 quick taps. Haley opened it to find the postboy, his cap askew, cheeks red from the cold. A letter for Miss Byrne, he said, surprised by his own words. Came from Philadelphia. She signed the ledger and took the envelope, her pulse quickening. The handwriting was unfamiliar but feminine, delicate, slanted, slightly as though written in haste. She broke the seal and unfolded the page. Dearest Haley, you were right to be wary. I couldn't speak before I left, but I must tell you now. Mr. Julian found me in the cellar after I saw him changing the logs in the ledger. He said he'd ruin me if I told anyone. I left that night. I've been living with a cousin in Philadelphia since. But I can't sleep. You deserve to know the truth. He forged the signature. Your Mr. Whitlock's brother never boarded that ship willingly. With trembling gratitude, Lottie. Haley read the letter twice, her hands shaking. The words blurred, but their meaning burned clear. The accident was no accident. The fear that haunted the house had roots deeper than gossip. She folded the paper carefully and hid it in her apron pocket. For the first time since arriving at the Channing estate, she did not feel small. She felt necessary. Outside, the snow had stopped. The air was cold and pure, the kind that cut through falsehood. As Haley stepped out into the pale morning light to deliver breakfast trays, she carried not just plates and porcelain, but truth. the kind that could no longer be contained beneath the elegance of chandeliers and the lies of the powerful. Upstairs, in his study, Elias waited for word from Boston. Downstairs, Haley held the letter close to her heart. Neither knew it yet, but the house, once so perfectly ordered, was tipping inch by inch toward its reckoning. The invitations were sent on embossed cream paper, sealed in wax the color of garnets. They called for elegance, discretion, and unity. 3 words that meant nothing and everything in Newport society. The Channing family, bruised by whispers and chilled by suspicion, had resolved to hold a second dinner, a gathering to reclaim the narrative, to reinforce the illusion that all remained intact beneath the chandeliered ceilings and imported lace. But even the air inside the grand house on Bellevue Avenue knew better. The preparations were swift and severe. Flowers were arranged in sharp white clusters, not soft pastels. The menu had been adjusted with obsessive care, as if finer pheasant could erase scandal. Servants were drilled on posture, on silence, on the positioning of cutlery and candlelight. Every reflection in the polished silver screamed, "Do not tremble, do not break." Haley Byrne dressed in silence. Her uniform was crisp, her cap pinned tightly. A faint bruise bloomed beneath her sleeve, the last ghost of Julian's grip. She had not shown it to anyone, not even to Elias. Outside her small window, the world glistened with frost. It was beautiful, it was merciless. Downstairs, the corridors buzzed with restrained urgency. The air carried the weight of imminent spectacle, like the breath before a curtain lifts. Haley moved through it with steady steps, each tray she lifted, each glance she avoided, adding to the rhythm of a woman holding her ground in a house built to swallow her. In the drawing room, Beatrix Channing stood near the fireplace, her gown a deep indigo velvet that kissed the floor with every step. Her hair was coiled high, each pin placed with surgical precision. Her expression betrayed nothing, neither defeat nor defiance. She smiled as guests arrived, her voice honeyed, her posture unyielding. Elias Whitlock entered shortly before the first course. He wore black, simple, clean, absolute. The only adornment was a small silver pin on his lapel, shaped like a lion's head. He greeted no one with warmth, but with formality. His gaze did not linger until it found Haley, briefly across the hall. She bowed her head. It was not submission. It was strength. The dinner began. Courses emerged like soldiers on parade. Duck glazed in port, oysters set in crushed ice, a compote of winter fruits glowing like jewels beneath sugared mist. Guests smiled too widely, laughed too lightly. Every glance was measured, every sip of wine a performance. Mr. Livingston, the journalist, sat midway down the table, invited out of necessity, dressed like a man who knew more than he should and enjoyed the discomfort of others. He raised his glass often, but drank sparingly. His pen was nowhere in sight. His eyes were always moving. Julian Channing arrived late. He walked in with careless confidence, his waistcoat of dark green velvet unbuttoned just enough to hint at rebellion. He kissed Beatrix's hand with exaggerated flair and took his seat with a smirk that never reached his eyes. The clinking of crystal, the murmurs of conversation, it all led to the moment everyone awaited, whether they admitted it or not. The toast. Beatrix stood first, as hostess, her voice melodic, smooth. "Tonight we gather not only as friends, but as family," she began. "In times of turbulence, it is unity that preserves us. It is legacy that defines us." She turned to Elias with a poised smile. "And in that spirit, I raise my glass to the future, to the alliances we honor, and to the names we trust." The room lifted glasses in quiet agreement. Elias did not. He remained seated. A murmur swept across the table like a breeze across silk. Then he rose, slowly with calm certainty. He held no glass, only silence. "I thank you, Miss Channing," he said, the formal title deliberate. "And I thank you all for your presence tonight. I know what is expected of me in this moment. I know the words I should say, the gratitude I should feign, the roles we are all meant to perform. He paused. No one breathed. "But I have learned," he continued, "that expectation is not truth. That silence is not peace. That loyalty, true loyalty, is not to a name, but to a principle." Beatrix's face stiffened. Her smile no longer reached even the corners of her mouth. "I cannot," Elias said, his voice low and clear, "in good conscience, continue an engagement built not on trust, but on transaction. I dissolve the understanding between the Channing and Whitlock families, and I do so with no malice, only with the desire to live honestly." The room erupted in gasps, in rustling sleeves, in the clatter of a fork against porcelain. Beatrix stood frozen, then sat with the grace of a woman trained not to crumble. Her eyes glistened, but she did not blink, not once. It was Julian who rose next, his smile venomous. "Well," he said, lifting his glass, "since we are all trading truths tonight, perhaps we should toast to reinvention. To those who ascend from laundry rooms to drawing rooms with nothing but a pair of sharp eyes and a well-timed bruise." He looked directly at Haley. "Tell me, Miss Byrne," he said loudly, "do you write your own history, or do you simply borrow someone else's name for the night?" Haley stood very still, her tray in hand. The air fractured. Elias moved before anyone could speak. He stepped forward, not in outrage, but in command. "She does not need to borrow anything," he said, each word deliberate. "Her name is her own. Her dignity is her own. And her integrity, Julian, is something you could not purchase with all the coin in your blood-soaked pockets." Silence. Elias turned to the guests, his eyes steady. "Let the record show that decency is not measured by lineage, but by courage." Julian's smirk faltered. He sat down, wine untouched. Haley did not move, but she looked at Elias, and he at her. It was the only truth left in the room. Later, after the guests had departed under the cloak of diplomatic silence, after Beatrix had disappeared behind a locked door and Julian had slunk out into the night, Elias returned to his study. He found Haley there near the window. "I shouldn't be here," she said softly. "You're exactly where you should be." She turned. Her face was pale from the weight of the night, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. "I'm not ashamed," she said, "of where I came from, of what I lost. Nor should you be. I've been called invisible," she whispered, "useful, replaceable. But tonight I was seen, and I don't know what to do with that." He stepped toward her, slowly. "I see you." The space between them was still. Sacred. He lifted his hand, but did not touch her cheek, only hovered near it, as if to ask permission. Her breath trembled. She closed her eyes, and then, gently, with reverence, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of conquest or promise. It was a kiss of recognition, of truth laid bare, of two lives crossing not out of rescue, but of equal hunger for something honest. They parted, breathless. No words followed. Only understanding. Outside, the frost thickened. Inside, two souls warmed not by certainty, but by something braver, something earned. And the house, once ruled by silence, now pulsed with the echo of truth. The wind off the sea had changed. No longer sharp with the salt-laced bite of winter, it now carried the edge of something quieter, resignation, perhaps, or the kind of stillness that follows a long-anticipated collapse. Snow clung to the wrought-iron gates of the Channing estate, muting the sound of hooves and wheels that came and went beneath the pale morning light. The household moved in strained silence, as if each footfall on polished wood risked cracking the veneer of what little dignity remained. In the drawing-room, with its velvet draperies drawn against the grey dawn, Haley Byrne stood facing Augustus Channing. The fire burned low behind him, casting thin shadows across his weathered face and the gold-threaded embroidery of his waistcoat. He was seated in a leather armchair like a man accustomed to giving orders from a throne. Yet something in his bearing had diminished. His cane rested across his knees, not as a symbol of control, but necessity. His pride, however, remained intact, and he clung to it like the last fragile remnant of a collapsing dynasty. You understand, he said, not kindly, not cruelly, that this can end. Tonight. Cleanly. Quietly. Haley did not respond. You'll have a letter of reference, Augustus continued, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. A generous one. You'll be well placed elsewhere. Chicago, perhaps. Or Savannah. Wherever you wish. And he reached into the drawer beside him and withdrew an envelope. You'll have enough to begin a new life with comfort. He held it out to her. She did not take it. The envelope lay like a challenge between them, its ivory paper soft under the firelight. I know what I'm offering, he said, his voice tightening, and I know the cost of letting this continue. Your loyalty is commendable, but misplaced. My daughter has suffered enough. This family has suffered enough. Haley's gaze was steady. She stepped forward, not to accept the envelope, but to look the man in the eye. I'm not here for your family's suffering, she said. I'm here for the truth. That's not for sale. You think this is about truth? His voice rose just slightly, the veneer beginning to crack. You think the world rewards integrity, Miss Byrne? I built my life on restraint, on silence. And look where it brought us. You want justice? It will ruin us all. Then let it, Haley said softly. He blinked. For a moment the weight of those words silenced even him. I buried my brother for less, Augustus whispered, almost to himself. Haley stepped back. Then you've buried enough. She turned and walked out, without another word. The envelope remained on the side table, unopened, untouched. That same afternoon, Julian Channing was escorted from the estate by two men in plain dark coats, their badges discreetly concealed. They did not make a scene. There were no shackles, no raised voices, but the look on Julian's face, confusion quickly swallowed by arrogance, told Haley that he still believed in his immunity, that even now some well-oiled mechanism of wealth or connection would rescue him from consequence. He passed her in the hall. Don't celebrate just yet, he said, his smile cruel. Newport forgets quickly. I don't, she replied, and she never would. The case against him had grown too complete to ignore. The butler's testimony, detailed and notarized, the missing ledger page, recovered and authenticated, the letter from Lottie, confirming Julian's threats and the altered shipping records. It was a lattice of lies now rendered visible and irreversible. He was taken away just after sunset, the sky streaked in rose and coal. The gaslights flickered as the carriage wheels vanished into the dark. By morning, the whispers would begin again. But this time, they would not protect him. In the days that followed, the Channing house moved like a clock winding down. Servants whispered more openly, doors closed more quietly. The younger maids avoided the drawing rooms. The housekeeper moved like a ghost. Beatrix, pale and unsmiling, prepared for departure. She sat in her mother's dressing room, gloves folded neatly in her lap. Her trunk had been packed with care. Parisian silks, morning gowns, gloves of pearl grey and charcoal, the colours of retreat. Her mother adjusted her veil in silence. You should have stopped it, the woman said coldly, not looking at her. I didn't have the power, Beatrix replied, her voice like porcelain about to crack. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Then you were never going to be enough. Beatrix said nothing. She folded the gloves again. When they left for Europe the next morning, the house did not mourn their absence. The silence they left behind was its own form of freedom. In the late afternoon, in a smaller parlour that had once belonged to the estate's steward, Elias Whitlock stood before Haley. The room was warm, intimate. Books lined the walls. The window was open just slightly, letting in the crisp scent of salted wind and early pine. The quiet between them was not tense, but sacred. I've made arrangements, he said, offering her a folded letter. A post in my household in Providence. Permanent, as secretary. You'll have independence, privacy, and my full support. Haley looked at the envelope, then at him. Why? She asked. Why now? His reply was gentle, unwavering. Because you've proven again and again that your mind and your integrity are not only valuable, but vital. Because I trust you, because I've come to believe that the world I thought I belonged to was built on silence, and that I no longer wish to live in silence. Haley's hands remained at her sides. She did not take the letter. "I'm not ready," she said. "I thought I would be, but there's more I need to do, not just for your house, not just for this name." He nodded. There was no disappointment in his eyes, only understanding. "Then I'll wait," he said. She smiled, faintly, but with something unshakable behind it. "I don't want you to wait," she replied. "I want you to keep going. And if our paths cross again, it won't be because one of us stopped. It'll be because we kept moving toward the same thing." He took a slow breath. "Justice. And something quieter," she said. "Something braver. Hope," he murmured. The clock on the mantel ticked softly between them. There was no touch, no promise spoken aloud, only a truth that lingered in the space between their breaths. That evening, after the house settled into its quieter rhythms, Haley stood once more at the top of the servant staircase. She looked down at the rails, at the corridor that had so often tried to shrink her into silence. She did not descend. She turned and walked through the main corridor, her steps sure, her spine straight, her presence no longer something to be hidden. Above her the chandelier flickered. Below her the past fell away. She had not chosen the cost of honor, but she had paid it, and now she would live by its light. The first snow of February had fallen over Providence like a soft benediction, blanketing the city's slate roofs and cobblestone alleys in a hush that blurred the sounds of industry and soothed the pulse of a restless world. Beneath the frost-laced eaves of a modest brownstone on Angel Street, a solitary figure stood by the window, watching the snow spiral past the lamplight. Elias Whitlock, impeccably dressed but wearied by months of inquiries, litigation, and unwanted fame, held in his gloved hands a letter addressed in a hand he would recognize in any storm, at any hour. The envelope was plain, no seal, no crest, only the gentle slope of Haley Burns' script, steady and unpretentious, like the woman herself. He broke the seal carefully, unfolding the pages with reverence, as though the ink might vanish under careless fingers. The first line halted his breath. "I no longer fear silence, but I will never serve it again." The letter was more than an update. It was a declaration. Haley had not disappeared into obscurity, as many had hoped. Instead, she had joined a coalition of Methodist churches, seamstress guilds, and Quaker meeting houses, gathering resources, testimonies, and moral weight to launch the New England Servants Trust, a fund and advocacy organization designed to protect household workers from exploitation. Using copies of the testimony, the recovered ledger, and the media coverage of the Channing downfall, she had compelled city leaders to listen, and they had. The final paragraph read, "I ask not for your permission, nor your patronage, but your partnership. This cannot be a legacy built on rescue, Elias. It must be built on justice. If you still believe in what we spoke of, come. If not, may peace find you anyway." He folded the letter slowly, holding it against his chest for a long moment. The wind sighed against the glass. Somewhere below, a carriage clattered by, the sound muted by the snow. Within the hour, he had called for his coat. Providence greeted him with frost and light. Icicles hung from the chapel roofs like crystal blades, and smoke curled from the chimneys of row houses, where iron stoves warmed quiet rooms. Elias's carriage rolled past the First Baptist Church, then veered into the narrow street leading to St. Matthias, a brick chapel modest in size, but rich in the scent of wax and cedar. She was waiting for him on the church steps. No announcement, no dramatic entrance, only Haley, wrapped in a navy wool coat, her gloveless hands red from labor, her cheeks flushed with cold and purpose. She had changed. There was strength in the way she stood now, not defiant but sovereign. When she saw him, she offered a nod. Nothing more. But it held more welcome than any embrace. They walked in silence down a path flanked by weathered gravestones and dormant rose bushes. Snow clung to every branch, every iron fence, muting the world into a cathedral of stillness. The crunch beneath their boots was the only sound. At the edge of the churchyard, beneath a bare tree bowed by snow, she stopped. The gravestone was simple. Aidan Byrne, 1876-1892. We were told to wait for justice. Elias removed his hat. Haley lowered her gaze, not in sorrow, but in reverence. He died in a textile mill, she said quietly. The looms caught fire, no exits. They said he shouldn't have been working at that age, but we needed bread. He looked at her, his voice low. And you have not stopped fighting since. Her gaze met his, unwavering, because no one did for him. A moment passed between them, long and hollowed out by things unsaid. But it was not absence. It was space, made sacred by respect. She took a slow breath. When the scandal faded and the article stopped, I wondered if I should let it rest, if perhaps the world wanted me silent again. But you didn't, he said. No, she answered. I found others, girls who ran from houses like the Channings, women dismissed for speaking of bruises, boys blamed for theft they didn't commit. We gathered, we organized. We're not servants anymore, Elias. We're voices. He reached into his coat and produced a slim folio, offering it to her. It's a promissory note, he said. Not in my name, in the trust's. I've spoken with my bank. The first donation will clear by the week's end, but I don't want it to be called a donation. She tilted her head, brow furrowing. Then what is it? A beginning. He looked around the snow-covered stones, the bare tree, the sky full of soft light. I lived too long measuring life in ledgers, he continued, in inheritance, in appearance, in duty. But you taught me something I had long forgotten. That to love anything true, one must first be willing to rebuild everything false. She did not weep, but her lips parted, and something trembled inside her. Fierce, quiet, whole. He stepped closer, not touching her, but near enough that the warmth of his breath mingled with hers in the cold. I didn't come to propose, he said, not out of guilt, not out of timing. She nodded once, letting the wind pass between them. I came to ask, he said gently, may I begin again? The snow began to fall again, gentle flakes landing on her lashes and coat. She looked into his eyes, her answer firm, without hesitation. Yes. The word rang louder than bells. They stood there for a long while, side by side, watching the snow settle upon the earth where her brother rested, and a new promise had been made, not of rescue, not of romance untethered to truth, but of shared purpose and a life no longer built upon silence. That evening, they returned to the brownstone where Haley lived among widows, teachers, and former cooks. Elias was welcomed not as benefactor or suitor, but as man willing to listen, learn, and follow. He said little. She said enough. They sat by the fire, a kettle whistling on the stove, and spoke of what would come next. Recruiting lawyers, translating testimony, convincing politicians. He made no grand declarations. She offered no demure smiles. Instead, there was trust and warmth, and the kind of respect that grew not from gallantry, but from shared battlefields. Outside, Providence slumbered beneath white roofs and oil lamps. Inside, a new chapter stirred, one neither of them could have imagined at a dinner table, surrounded by knives of silver and tongues of poison. Their war was not over, but the winter had softened, and the letter had done more than arrive. It had begun. The scent of early spring drifted through the opened windows of Elias Whitlock's home in Providence, mingling with the warm aroma of bread just pulled from the oven and the crisp trace of lemon zest from a pitcher of water infused with mint. It was Easter Sunday, 1896, and though no carriages lined the street, no footman flanked the stairwell, and no violinist played in a gilded hall, the house breathed with life, quiet, honest, earned. In the dining room, the table was long but simple, set with mismatched porcelain plates trimmed in fading gold leaf. The lace runner bore tiny imperfections where it had been mended by hand. There were no crystal candelabras, only beeswax tapers flickering in modest brass holders. Yet for all its restraint, the space radiated warmth, its very walls steeped in the comfort of second chances. Elias stood at the head of the table, his hand resting gently on the back of Haley Byrne's chair. His coat had been hung on a peg. His sleeves were rolled neatly to the forearm. His collar was unbuttoned, not from carelessness, but from quiet intention. Haley sat at his right, no longer clad in uniform, but in a soft grey silk dress, fitted at the bodice and falling in modest pleats to the floor. A small brooch of jet and pearl, once her mother's, was fastened at her throat. Her hair was drawn up, a few loose strands curled by the afternoon's humidity. She had chosen no gloves, no corset, no performance. She did not need one. To her left sat Mrs. Edmonds, once the Channing cook, now employed as a coordinator for the Servants' Trust relief kitchens. Across from her, Matthew, a former footman, now working as a literacy instructor for young stable boys, laughed easily with Joan, who had returned from Philadelphia to help archive testimonies from servants too fearful to speak aloud. The room shimmered with a kind of quiet revolution. In the corner, beside a vase of early daffodils, a newspaper clipping lay carefully angled against a stack of documents. Heiress exiled, servant justice restored. Providence Journal, March 29, 1896. Beneath the bold headline was a column recounting the legal dismantling of the Channing estate, the conviction of Julian Channing on multiple counts of coercion and conspiracy, and the unprecedented formation of the New England Domestic Workers Alliance, founded in part by Miss Haley Byrne, formerly of Newport. No one pointed to the paper now. Its presence was enough. Elias raised his glass, not wine but mulled cider. He did not clear his throat or tap his fork. He merely looked around the table with eyes softened by time and clarity. "I was once told that the greatest power at any table lies in who is invited to sit," he said. "I see now that it lies not in the invitation, but in who dares to claim their seat." He turned his gaze to Haley then, and she, always still in a room full of movement, tilted her head and smiled. Not the smile of someone flattered, but the kind of smile that comes only from having faced fire and lived to rebuild from the ash. They dined simply. Roast lamb with rosemary, carrots glazed in honey and thyme, boiled potatoes dusted with sea salt, and a pie brought by the local pastor's wife. There was no orchestra, only the sound of laughter, chairs scraping gently, stories passed like bread across the table. Later, as dusk crept into the corners of the house, washing the walls in amber and blue, the guests began to rise. Some lingered in the parlor, examining the bulletin board where new trust initiatives were pinned, legal aid clinics, night classes, and emergency lodgings. Haley excused herself quietly to the kitchen. She had left a note beside the basin, a hand-drawn map of mill tenements near Pawtucket where abuse had gone unreported. There were names listed, half-spelled and uncertain. She rinsed the ink from her hands. When she returned, Elias was waiting by the door, holding her shawl. "You never stop," he said gently, wrapping it around her shoulders. She lifted her gaze to his. "Neither do you." They stepped outside onto the stone path, lined with crocuses and damp earth, the sky above a swirl of lavender and fading rose. A soft wind rustled the bare branches above them, carrying the last breath of winter toward the river. Side by side they walked. No carriage, no witnesses, only the sound of their shoes against the gravel and the hush of twilight around them. "I've thought often," Elias said after a long pause, "of how that night began. The dinner, the warning you gave me." Haley exhaled, her eyes scanning the silhouette of a spire in the distance. "I didn't know what would come of it. Only that silence would have cost more." "You changed everything," he murmured. "No," she replied, looking straight ahead. "I refuse to be unchanged." They stopped at the edge of the path, where the garden fence marked the end of his property and the beginning of the public green. Children's laughter echoed faintly from a distant hill where a church bell began to ring. Elias turned to face her, his hands still at his sides. "You've asked for no vows, no titles, no promises." She met his gaze, unwavering. "Because none of that builds a life. Only what we do, day by day, together." He stepped closer, and she did not retreat. In that breath between dusk and night, the space between them disappeared, not with urgency, not with passion's blaze, but with a gentleness forged in shared fight. His hand found hers, palm to palm, steady. She closed her fingers around his. They did not kiss. They did not need to. Because love, when earned, when honored, when bathed, not in secrets but in truth, does not clamor to be seen. It lives quietly in gestures, in the holding of a hand, in the presence of someone who listened and stayed. And so they stood, two figures in the fading light, no longer bound by scandal or shame, no longer shaped by what others whispered behind lace curtains. They had rewritten their story, not from above nor below, but beside one another. And at last she had a seat at the table, not as a servant, not as a survivor, but as herself, whole, heard, and home. The sea air in Newport still carried the scent of salt and hydrangea, but the streets felt changed, less gilded, less cruel in their silence. The grand houses still stood, their facades washed clean by Atlantic winds, yet behind many doors, the old hierarchies had fractured. Names once whispered with reverence now carried a different weight, and among those who remembered the scandal, some chose shame. Others chose reckoning. It had been 4 years since Haley Byrne sat at Elias Whitlock's side, no longer a servant but an equal. And now, in the warmth of early spring 1900, the garden outside their Providence home bloomed with more than flowers. It bloomed with legacy. Children's laughter spilled from the open windows, two voices, bright and distinct. Aidan, named for the brother Haley lost, was 3 years old and already stubborn in his questions. He had his mother's eyes full of storm and thought, and his father's quiet watchfulness. At his side toddled Clara, not yet 2, who laughed with abandon and climbed everything in sight. Her hair curled at the temples like her grandmother's, though she'd never know her. Inside the parlour, Elias sat by the fireplace, older now but unbowed, a little slower on the stairs, a little warmer in the eyes. He watched the flames as he wrote his final remarks for the founding conference of the New England Workers' Forum, a public policy initiative born from the trust he and Haley had built, first from scandal, then from shared belief. The ledger page that had once condemned the Channings now hung framed above the mantel, its ink faded, its purpose fulfilled. Haley entered carrying a basket of linens, pausing to gaze at her husband. She still wore no corset, still walked with the certainty of someone who had once been underestimated by every room she entered. Her hands bore small scars from years of work, before and after Providence, but she wore them with pride. Beneath her wedding ring, a thin band of silver, etched with the initials NS, served as a silent tribute to those she had met along the way. Nora Simmons, the maid who fled Julian's threats. Samuel Leary, the butler whose quiet confession turned a case. Beatrix Channing, who vanished into Europe and never returned, not as scandal, not as savior. Haley often wondered where Beatrix had gone. Rumors spoke of Vienna. Others claimed madness or retreat. But in truth, no one knew. Only that she had chosen exile over apology, and that silence had cost her everything. Julian Channing remained behind bars, serving a sentence reduced not by remorse, but by wealth. His name had been scrubbed from family records, his portrait removed from galleries. His father, Augustus, passed quietly 2 years after the trial, buried without fanfare, remembered only by creditors and attorneys, but the staff who once served them had not been erased. Joan, the maid whose testimony shook the courtroom, now oversaw a halfway house for orphaned girls. Matthew taught reading and labor rights in textile towns across Rhode Island. Mrs. Edmonds, ever the force of nature, had published a pamphlet of recipes and kitchen memoirs titled The Cook Who Spoke, which became unexpectedly popular among city wives curious for the truth behind the silver service. And Hayley? She had become a symbol, not by choice, but by necessity. She spoke rarely at public events. Her voice, though strong, still carried the tremor of too many years ignored, but when she did speak, rooms stood still. Her presence was requested at state forums, in courthouse corridors, even in private salons, where wives of senators leaned forward, breathless, hoping to understand the world beyond their china. She never traded her truth for comfort, and she never let anyone forget where it began. Every Easter, she and Elias returned to Newport, not to the mansions, but to the back alleys and small parishes where forgotten names still whispered through old floorboards. They would leave flowers on the steps of St. Matthias, where Aidan Byrne was buried. Now they brought their children, letting them run in the sunlight among daffodils and echoes. It had not been a perfect life. There were setbacks, griefs, days where doubt threatened to reclaim the ground they had gained, but it was a true life. One made with hands that remembered work, with hearts that remembered silence, and with courage that refused to retreat. As Hayley stepped into the parlor that afternoon, she placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder. He looked up, setting aside his pen. "They're in the garden," she said, her voice warm. Clara tried to plant her shoe. He chuckled softly, standing. "Then it will grow into something fiercely determined." They walked to the porch, hand in hand, just as they had 4 years before. The wind lifted the hem of her dress and tugged at his collar. The children tumbled through new grass, their laughter louder than bells, and in that moment, beneath the soft gold of spring, surrounded by the world they had helped change, the past did not vanish. It bowed and let them pass forward. Some stories end with fireworks, others with silence. But this one ends with a seat at the table, earned through truth, dignity, and quiet rebellion. Hayley Byrne's journey reminds us that bravery doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it whispers instead of shouts. And sometimes it takes everything just to stay standing in a room that tried to erase you. This was not only a love story between a maid and a magnate, it was a story about conscience over convenience, about rewriting the script others gave us, about reclaiming the power to say, "I will not be invisible anymore." And now, we'd love to hear from you. What part of Hayley's journey moved you the most? Did a moment surprise you, inspire you, maybe even break your heart a little? If you made it to the very end, write the word courage in the comments. That way, we'll know you were right here with us until the last page turned. And if this story stirred something in you, if you believe these kinds of narratives deserve more space in the world, consider supporting the team behind these stories with a super thanks on YouTube. It doesn't have to be much, just what feels right to you. Every bit helps us bring more historical dramas like this to life, crafted with care and soul. But if you can't give right now, we understand completely. You can still help in a beautiful way. Share this video with someone who cherishes period romances as much as you do. Whether it's a friend, a sister, a mother, or a book club, your share might bring this story to a heart that needs it. Before you go, don't miss the other unforgettable historical romances we're leaving for you in the cards above. If you loved Hayley and Elias, we promise you'll fall just as hard for the next couple waiting in the wings. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for watching, feeling, and remembering, because stories like this only matter when they're felt.